It can be tough sometimes to find a nice quiet place to talk about Bertrand Russell's criticism of Barclays Idealism, but I'll give it a shot. Russell ultimately dismisses Barclays Idealism, but he, on specific grounds, not on the basis that it's obviously absurd. One of the things that he says towards the beginning of the chapter is those who are unaccustomed to philosophical speculation may be inclined to dismiss such a doctrine, that is, idealism, as obviously absurd. He says, well, it's not absurd. That is, the notion that all that exists are minds and ideas, and that there is no such thing as matter, is not obviously absurd. That is, it's not clearly wrong. There is an argument behind it, and even if Russell ultimately disagrees with that argument, it doesn't mean that it's absurd. He says, hence common sense leaves us completely in the dark as to the true intrinsic nature of physical objects, and if there were good reason to regard them as mental, we could not legitimately reject this opinion merely because it strikes us as strange. The truth about physical objects must be strange. Why must it be strange? Well, from Russell's own beginning point in this distinction between what is given, that is, sense data, as opposed to an external object, is more or less admitted that, at least in our experience of nature, our experience of the physical world, we never really experience, at least in any direct sense, physical objects at all. They're unknown, if not unknowable. So that the reality about physical objects, it's got to be surprising, because we're not really familiar with them except perhaps indirectly through our sense data. But he does reject Barclays Idealism. And what is Barclays Idealism, at least as Russell presents it? He says of Berkeley, he shows that all we know immediately, and remember that immediate as opposed to mediated distinction, he shows that all we know immediately when we perceive the tree consists of ideas, in his sense of the word, and he argues that there is not the slightest ground for supposing that there is anything real about the tree, which is the object in question, except what is perceived. Its being, he says, consists in being perceived. In the Latin of the schoolmen, its esse is percipi. That is, its being is in its being perceived. So how does Russell criticize Berkeley here? Well, Russell believes that Berkeley has a certain confusion associated with the word idea. Now remember that Russell makes a distinction between sensation, which is an act of the mind or an act of consciousness, the act of sensing, as opposed to sense data. Berkeley, he says, fails to make that distinction. He says, in the first place, there is a confusion engendered by the use of the word idea. That is, a confusion in Berkeley's presentation, according to Russell, in the use of the word idea. He says that Berkeley fails to make that distinction between the act of sensing, or what Russell calls sensation, as opposed to the object or content of the sensation, which Russell calls sense data. Berkeley believes that both sensation, the act of the mind in grasping whatever object or content is before it, and the sense data are both ideas and both in the mind. Whereas Russell leaves open the possibility that although the act of sensation, the act of mind, could be said to be in the mind, that the content, that is the sense data, is not necessarily in the mind. Well, if it's not in the mind, then where is it, you might ask? Well, Russell doesn't exactly answer that question, but he gives you a different way of thinking about it. He says, taking the word idea in Berkeley's sense, there are two quite distinct things to be considered whenever an idea is before the mind. Before the mind, that is, presented to the mind, or the thing that the mind is directed towards. There is, on the one hand, the thing of which we are aware, say the color of my table, and on the other hand, the actual awareness itself, the mental act of apprehending the thing. The mental act is undoubtedly mental, but is there any reason to suppose that the thing apprehended is in any sense mental? Our previous arguments concerning the color did not prove it to be mental. They only proved that its existence depends upon the relation of our sense organs to the physical object, in our case, the table. That is to say, they proved that a certain color will exist in a certain light if a normal eye is placed at a certain point relatively to the table. They did not prove that the color is in the mind of the percipient. So, what is Russell saying there? Well, certainly sensations, the acts of sensing something, are mental acts and therefore are what we might call ideas. But sense data are not in the mind in Russell's conception. They are before the mind. So what is the relationship then between sense data and sensations? Well, it is a logical dependence, you might say. He says, of Berkeley, he proved first by arguments which were largely valid that our sense data cannot be supposed to have an existence independent of us, but must be, in part at least, in the mind, in the sense that their existence would not continue if there were no seeing or hearing or touching or smelling or tasting. That is, if there are sense data, that is, if sense data exist, then that logically implies that sensations exist as well. That is, there are no sense data without sensations. That's what I would call logical dependence. That is, whenever you have a sense datum, you have a sensation, so that there are no sense data without sensations. That's a logical relationship of dependence. However, that does not mean that sense data are mental. It does not mean that sense data are in the mind. It does not even mean that they are subjective, I guess, in the fullest sense. What it means is that they depend upon, for their existence, a subject. So that's a quite important distinction, and if we can trace it back to earlier chapters, that distinction on the one hand between sensations, which are clearly mental, and sense data, which depend upon the mental, but those colors, those tastes, the content of our experiences in general does not mean that those things are in the mind. It just means rather that they are before the mind, and that they would not exist if mind did not exist. But it doesn't mean that they are mind. That's an incredibly important distinction. He calls it here the distinction between act and object in our apprehending of things. The act being the sensation, the object being the content of our sensation, or the sense data. And so one wonders, what is it that really Russell is defending here? What does he want to sort of picture of our relationship with reality? Is he really committed to? I think he believes that Berkeley's main failing is this. He says, the faculty of being acquainted with things other than itself is the main characteristic of a mind. And Russell doesn't really defend that. That seems to be a deep commitment that Russell has. But I think he ultimately rejects Barclays Idealism because it doesn't square with that notion of what a mind is, and that root commitment Russell has, that the whole function or the whole nature of a mind is to be acquainted with things other than itself, and the implication, I guess, at least for Russell, is that Barclays Idealism only allows for us to be acquainted with our own minds, with the modifications of mind, which Berkeley calls ideas.